Bem, nós temos
Okay, well, we've got interpretation to English and from English to Portuguese. I would like to, first of all, in the name of the National High Court, to welcome you all, especially to Ambassador Mauro Vieira, Minister of State or Secretary of State of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, who has been on his second mandate as Chancellor, as he has in his first mandate, been doing great work. He's a reference for Brazilian diplomacy. And when I speak of Brazilian diplomacy, I'm looking towards the past, all the way to the past up to nowadays. It's not just in the last few years. And beyond the concerns of what we would call the daily life of a Minister of Foreign Affairs, I have a strong feeling in what regards the subject that is going to be dealt with here today. Climate change, protection of the oceans, ocean here in the singular, not in the plural, actually, because it's one single ocean, truly, that goes all around the globe. As you well know, this event takes place just before the climate COP at Berlin. And therefore, the time could not be more ideal. So there's just two comments I would like to highlight here. Perhaps towards the end, I might say something else. First of all, that the ocean is an environmental asset or an environmental resource that is of interest to all, to those who have seas and those who do not. Considering the environmental services that the ocean delivers to the community of life as a whole, to our planet, and not just us human beings. On the contrary of compared to other natural resources that has almost a specific address, so to say, we could list the countries that have deserts, and we could have a discussion on deserts in the Amazon would be something that would make no sense. Why? Because the Amazon doesn't have a desert, and the desert does not have a tropical forest. On the ocean, however, or the debate about the ocean, this context does not apply because those who don't have an ocean have as much interest or as implicated as those who do, such as Brazil, that has a very long coast. The second comment is in the fact that we are in a court where not just the ocean, but the climate and the environment nowadays is a central subject of the judiciary systems of the whole world, especially in Brazil. This court that receives resources from 27 high courts, state supreme courts, and 6 federal regional courts. In English, I'm trying to help the interpreters here. I'm sure they know already. Federal courts, federal courts of appeal. So it's 6 of those. Well, we judge per year more environmental issues than all the Supreme Courts of whole Latin America put together. Several times more. And the subject of the oceans is present here all the way from the question of pollution, more recently that of plastic in the oceans, but of the natural resources and maritime resources themselves, the protection of the whales, the protection of turtles. There are precedents in the National High Court. There are precedents about coral reefs in the National High Court, without mentioning the tens of cases here in the National High Court taking care of the non-sustainable exploitation of natural beauties of our coast, because it is not enough to protect the ocean. We must also protect the physical terrestrial body that touches the oceans, with a highlight to the mangroves. And once again, on mangroves, we have many precedents here. With these brief notes, I'd like to thank the presence of all those who are here, to thank Ambassador Susan Kleebank, who is, in truth, the person responsible for all of this here, and at the at the National High Court. It's not that she requests or determines, but she insinuates, and we try to guess what she wants, and we do it. Because these proposals always come with a very solid public interest content. I'd like to thank the presence of the Rear Admiral Ricardo Jacques Ferreira, that is a great specialist in the whole marine, that is made of specialists. They're not just about the ocean. Let's not forget about the waters, inland waters. That is another sweetwater body. And the temptation of speaking of a promotion is probably going to happen. Currently, he's Rear Admiral, but, well, that's all I'm going to say, actually. Today, he's Rear Admiral. But in 3 weeks, he might no longer be a Rear Admiral. Well, it's a great joy to have you here. We know your work, and we celebrate your specialty, your dedication to this fundamental subject to the planet. And the federal judge Caio Marinho, that is the president of the Federal Judges Association, that is one of the institutions that supports this event. Special thanks to a team of the National High Court, especially Minister Arnaldo Fernandes, who is kind of a condominium. He's from the Itamaraty, but nowadays renders very important services to the National High Court, to the Brazilian Justice, but always as a diplomat at service of his country. So these are the general observations. I wish you all an excellent event. You must have observed the Sebastião Salgado pictures in the back. The STJ has the biggest collection of photographs by Sebastião Salgado of the public buildings of all of Brazil. And we're on the way of increasing this collection, because we're going to open a gallery called Genis. They're called Justice and Peace. Oh. Photographs of workers, of war, and the other subjects that were covered by him, by this genius of photography and art, Sebastião Salgado. Well, thank you very much. And without any further ado, I hand over to Minister. Well, and you must have noticed that there is no ceremonial. We have several ceremonialists in the STJ, but I don't really use them. I do the ceremonial part myself at these events, except the extremely formal events, but this is an academic event. Obviously, gathering specialists and the diplomats that are interested on this subject matter and represent the countries here in Brasília, but it is a scientific event, and that is why I am doing this ceremonial part myself. And yes, now it is up to the Minister of Foreign Affairs, Minister Mauro Vieira. Your Excellency, Justice Herman Benjamin, President of the National High Court. First of all, I'd like to thank your very nice words about me that I attribute to our very long friendship. And None that is done on one's own. I've always done many things in the ministry. In the first mandate, when I was the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of President Dilma Rousseff, as well as now, always counting on your counsel, your support, and with this association on several initiatives. Thank you very much. My colleague, Ambassador Susan Klebank, that is the Asian Pacific Ambassador of the Itamaraty. We're Admiral Ricardo Jacques Ferreira, Secretary of the uh, Maritime Resources, and Caio Marinho of the president of the Federal Judges Association of Brazil, the AJUFI. It is very relevant that we have this event nowadays, this international academic event, just before the opening of the COP30 summit, of the climate summit, that will be opened formally, the heads of state summit that will be opened officially on the next Thursday. For the first time, the oceans will be part of the agenda of the COP leaders on this part about climate and nature. 40% of the world population lives at less than 100 kilometers from the coast. Almost 90% of world commerce goes through oceans. The blue economy has about 30% of the world GDP. If it were a country, the oceans would be the seventh biggest economy in the world. And with their importance, the SDG on water continues being the less financed among all the SDGs. And while that the use in an unsustainable way of the oceans continues increasing. An increase of the level of water, desertification, loss of biodiversity, the increase of the level of the ocean, and the extreme climate events are interconnected threats that need to be faced in an integrated manner. The recent passage of the Melissa hurricane by the Caribbean shows the magnitude of that such events, such extreme events, continue occurring in our days. Here in Brazil, the floods in the Rio Grande do Sul in the past and the droughts that are ever longer are also signs of the same phenomenon. The government of President Lula took on the facing of global warming once again, taking on Brazil's historical leadership once more. Allow me to cite here the good news that was given a few days ago by the Ministry of Environment that 2025 represent the third consecutive year of the Amazon reduction, the reduction of deforestation of the Amazon. It was a 50% decrease under his government compared to the previous one. My dear friends, the respect of the right maritime law centered on the UN Convention on Maritime Law, it gives legal clarity about the rights and obligations, recognizing that the ocean floor and their resources belongs to all of humanity. For Brazil, the oceans should be a space of solidarity and international justice. We act with this spirit in the negotiations of the agreement on maritime biodiversity, aside from the national jurisdiction, the BBNJ in its English acronym, and the instruments ratification that we will place in the next few days. With this spirit, we also engage in the negotiations of the International Authority of Maritime Flows with the possible exploitation of mineral resources in the maritime areas of each country, and we declare a preventive pause in activities of this type. Aside from the regulation of the exploitation of the maritime resources, equally relevant to have the adoption of active measures of fighting on the climate change in the maritime environment. We follow with great interest and engagement the recent decision of the International Justice Court and of the International Tribunal on maritime law on the states and the climate change and oceans. Within the International Maritime Authority, we support the adoption of the basket of actions of medium and long term for the reduction of greenhouse gases in the maritime sector. Unfortunately, delayed by a year, but with which we continue committed to. We also anticipate that our objective of 30% of protected areas until 2030, adopted in the context of the Convention on Biological Diversity. Brazil has already almost 27% of its jurisdictional waters protected, a total of 970,000 square kilometers. In June, in the UN Conference on Oceans, President Lula announced the commitment to protect an extra 240,000 square kilometers until 2030, increasing the coverage of our exclusive economic region or zone protected to over 33%. Lastly, I cannot forget to mention the important work of the Commission of International Law of the UN on the legal implications of the increase of the sea levels. I'd like to mention here my participation in this process of Professor Jorge Galindo, legal consultant of Itamaraty for over 10 years and a candidate of Brazil to the International Maritime Law Court that will speak in this seminary later today. My dear President, we have a moral, ethical, and legal obligation to protect the oceans and use their resource in a sustainable manner to tend to the needs of current and future generations. Brazil is and will be part of the collective global effort to make this objective a reality. Thank you very much for participation, and I wish you all a fantastic event. Thank you very much. I'd like to now invite Ambassador Susan Kleebank to take the floor. I'm changing the order here. She was not expecting to have to speak, but I think it is important that she do.
Firstly, I would like to thank you, sir, for making this, having this court available for us for this theme that is very interesting to our reality. I would have done a small intervention in English in consideration to our foreign participants. If you allow me, I'll do it in English.
Justice Herman Benjamin, distinguished Justice Mr. Mauro Vieira, Mr. Tebatoki Tarvetia, de Kiribati, Mrs. Francilia Adiri, from Nauru, ambassadors, members of the diplomatic corps, ladies and gentlemen. I wish to express my sincere appreciation to the Chief Justice for the invaluable support in organizing this forum on the law of the sea. I also have the honor to welcome the distinguished representatives of Kiribati and Nauru that I mentioned before. This forum focuses on sea level rise and the law of the sea and underscores the imperative of sustainable cooperation amongst Brazil and the small islands developing states. We have had the opportunity to appreciate the singularity that springs from the Pacific, in particular through the praiseworthy engagement of Kiribati in the facilitative working group of the Indigenous Peoples Platform of COP30, and the difference that now do in making on the debates about maritime resources. The upcoming COP30 will be a historic opportunity to translate our joint intents into concrete action through courage, cooperation, and commitment to strengthen multilateralism, to connect climate agenda to people's life, and accelerate progress across the regime's 5 pillars: mitigation, adaptation, finance, technology, and capacity building, within and beyond the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. Brazil believes that the transition must be fair and anchored in reducing inequalities among and within countries. Combating climate change and the fight against poverty and hunger are mutually reinforcing goals. For Brazil, developing countries must have access to climate finance at the scale and on the terms that do not exacerbate debt vulnerabilities. It is therefore necessary to advance reform of the international financial architecture to reduce the cost of capital, expand fiscal space, and mobilize investments and technology for developing countries. Let us send a signal of hope by renewing our shared commitment to protect humanity from the worst climate scenarios, notably the sea level rise that the minister mentioned before. In that spirit, I respectfully request to the governments of the countries here represented to support in a written form for the candidacy of Professor Jorge Galindo, who's going to speak very soon, for election as a judge of the International Tribunal for the Law of the Seas. Professor Galindo combines academic excellence with practical experience as a distinguished scholar at the University of Brasília. Brazil is confident that this election would make a valuable contribution to the Tribunal's bench. Confident that this event will inaugurate continued exchange among our countries, I invite you to join me later on in a toast to the distinguished delegations of Kiribati and Nauru and Australia that are also here represented, with the best wishes for the continued prosperity of our nations. Thank you.
It's very important that we emphasize that when we discuss ocean, a giant by nature, we are concerned, and we have to be concerned with the future, the present and the future of small island states. So at the core of the justice discussion, there is an ethical discussion. What are our responsibilities? Those of us that have caused most of the CO2 emissions that are in the atmosphere. And I think this couldn't be a better place to have a discussion in Brazil, in a court, about justice and ethics. Queria convidar agora o
Now I'd like to invite Rear Admiral Jacques Ferreira, who will speak in the name of the Interministerial Commission for Sea Resources from the Brazilian Navy. Your Excellency, Ambassador Mauro, Chief Justice Herman Benjamin from the National High Court of Brazil, Ambassador Kleeman from the Itamaraty, Mr. Caio Marim from AJUF, ladies and gentlemen, it's with great satisfaction that the Navy of Brazil and the Interministerial Commission are associated to this forum of the law of the sea and the sustainable use of the oceans, and to highlight the growing importance of the seas and oceans for the world. And according to the speech of Lula in the G20, representing the leader of the Navy, that the CIRM, since its creation 50 years ago, has had a strategic role in the coordination efforts of Brazil in the sea. With the joint work carried out by sailors, diplomats, and scientists, Brazil amplified its legal areas to the 5.7 million square kilometers, which is our blue Amazon. Obviously, this space demands responsibility from the state and from society. And this interministerial coordination has allowed Brazil to have a full and integrated use of its laws and rights on this biodiverse area, natural resources, and of great economic and environmental value. In this moment in which the world focus in Brazil and in Belém with the COP30, it's even more essential the role of the oceans in regulating the world climate, absorbing a lot of heat, carbon, and that's why it should have a central position in the mitigation of climate change. So in this context, the CIRM, through its secretariat, jointly with the Ministry of Environment and Climate Change, has been implementing the spatial planning all over Brazil. As seen in the OECD report of 2025, there are necessary three elements for us to have a sustainable use of resources. One was well talked about, which is international cooperation, and which is fundamental. The second is the capacity of the state to face crime, like environmental crimes like predatory fishing or other cases, oil spills in our territory, and other crimes, and to have a governance tool that allows the sustainable use of the oceans. And this is where the spatial maritime planning is important, making compatible the sustainable use of resources with conservation and preservation of these ecosystems. To conquer and keep this blue Amazon demands a strong navy that is modern and present, that is capable not only to defend the space, but to take the state to where it is necessary. And it's this presence that assures that the economic activities within our waters happen in conformity with sustainability goals, guaranteeing that the exploration is done in a responsible way and in the benefit of this society and future. So with this forum, we'd like to reiterate the commitment of the NAVE and our commission to the sustainability, our sovereignty, and all of these are pillars that are very relevant to guarantee a healthy resiliency for future generations that is productive and in equilibrium with the planet. Thank you very much. I thank you, Rear Admiral Ricardo Jacques Ferreira. And to conclude this opening, I would like to invite the federal judge, Caio Marinho. Good morning to all. I'd like to thank Chief Justice Herman from the National High Court of Justice and the Federal Council. It's a pleasure to work at your side. I'd also like to greet Ambassador Mauro Vieira from Foreign Affairs, Ambassador Susan Banks, Mr. Jacques Ferreira, Rear Admiral Jacques Ferreira, and conducting the AJUFI, which is the Federal Judges Association. So it's a great pleasure to participate in this forum, very relevant. I am a magistrate in Belém for 10 years. We are starting this very important event in Pará. And together with Chief Justice Herman, and especially important participating in this forum, because here we are reaffirming the law as an instrument of preserving life in this planet. As Minister or Chief Justice Hammond said, we debated the sea more than a geographical area. We have to debate the ethical dimension of what is our responsibility in preservation, especially we from the magistrates, how we should analyze the conflicts that are related to the use and occupation of these spaces, and these conflicts come to judicial cases for us to conduct. So in our waters, we find great issues of our time. Some with climate change, protection of biodiversity, sovereignty of insular people, and the fair sharing of natural resources. So it's in this scenario that it takes a civilizational aspect. Like the Rear Admiral mentioned, the responsibility of the state and society, it is a collective responsibility to work for this common heritage. The judicial branch, under the leadership of Chief Justice Hammond, has been singular in facing these challenges of sustainability. At the head of AJUFI, we'd like to add to this movement in promoting dialogue not between only magistrates, but scientists, diplomats, and public managers. There isn't sustainability without justice, and no justice without cooperation. Certainly, the debates we will have during this day will conduct us to an advance in this theme. That's why I wish you all a very good event. Thank you. In closing, I'd like to make an observation. Those who do not know the Brazilian legal system as regards the competency and the jurisdiction of the federal justice for all themes of the sea. So, any legal discussion on the oceans or seas in Brazil doesn't go to the state level law. We receive resources from 27 federal courts of appeals courts, but the competency of the federal justice and the importance of the president of the Federal Judges Association, AJUF, here. But it's different to other countries. It's not only the sea itself, but the beaches. Everything that happens in beaches is of the competency of the federal justice. Let's not give name of countries where beaches have been privatized. No, not in Brazil. The beaches are public and belong to the union. And we have dozens of precedents reaffirming the nature, the public nature of the beaches, taking down buildings in spaces that belong to all, be they rich, poor, Brazilians, foreigners that come to delight with the natural beauty of our beaches. So we take these very seriously and everything in the federal justice system. So we have 27 states. Of course, not all of them have a coastline, but most do. Imagine if each state justice had their own jurisprudence on the protection of the sea. It would be a cacophony of comprehensions as regards the sea. This does not happen in Brazil, first, because the National High Court of Brazil, the STJ, unifies. And second, everything is within the federal justice. So, having said that, I would like to thank the presence of all. And especially the presence of Ambassador Ahmad Mohami from Qatar, that comes frequently to our tribunal, Ambassador Mohammed Ali bin Al from Azmi from Malaysia, and to thank the representatives from the diplomatic missions, Minister Desmond Kwang from Singapore, from Australia, Dr. Vanessa Voss, from Saudi Arabia, of the diplomat Fahad Mansour Garmala, and other representatives of diplomatic missions here in Brazil. We are very honored to count with your presence. Tebatok Tavesia and Miss Francilia Adili. So it is a pleasure to have you here, and I hope you come more times. We are separated with a big distance, but united by the oceans. Thank you very much. I declare the session closed.
So let's go back to our agenda. As you know, the topic of this symposium is very, very broad. So we thought it would be important to have a panorama of the main issues, and one of them by Professor Jorge Galindo from the University of Brasília, and he's also the General Counsel of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, a highly respected international law scholar and an expert on the law of the sea. And later on, by Zoom, we are going to hear from one of my favorite scholars on the issues that we are discussing here, Professor Simi Payne. She'll be speaking, as I said, virtually and covering areas that will not be covered by Professor Galindo. What I suggest is that you speak, and then we open up for discussion, and then we invite Professor Simi Payne to join us by Zoom. Is that okay? Muito obrigado. Então vamos.
Okay, thank you very much then. So let's start on the scientific part of our event. Professor Galindo, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Mr. Judge Herman Benjamin. It's quite an honor to be here and to join you in this quite important event with authorities from different countries. And I would like to say that the topic that I will address today, it's of utmost importance, not only for issues regarding climate change, but also to the future of humanity itself. Now I'm going to change into Portuguese because the lecture was prepared in Portuguese, but in any case, I will try to speak slowly, especially for translators. Bom, muito obrigado a todos.
Well, thank you very much. I would like to greet not just Justice Herman Benjamin, but Master Susan Kleebank and the other diplomatic authorities here, officials of the maritime authorities and other authorities. As I mentioned, we're dealing with a subject I think extremely important, not just for questions related to climate change, but also for the future of humanity itself. And a specific comment here to give some context on the subject and the choice of this subject. As Minister Mauro Vieira said, I have the honor of being part of the International Commission of the UN. And I explain for those that are not very familiar that the UN clause is an organism that existed with a mandate from the UN for International Progressive Charter, or the UN Charter, that since the 40s is dealing on a series of subjects, creates subjects for convention studies, sometimes guides as well, for interpretation of international law by the states. An international commission this year finalized the treatment of the subject, the increase of the sea levels in regards to international law. As everyone knows, the increase of sea levels is a fact. This is not an opinion. It is not. It is a scientific fact.
Que inclusive o IPCC, acho que todos sabem, as últimas opiniões consultivas de tribunais internacionais.
The last international courts that were mentioned here by Minister Mauro Vieira, the International Court on Maritime Law, the International Courts have proffered have proffered opinions on this and counseling on this, and have stated that the studies by the IPCC is the best science we have available. And the IPCC, that is an organism that reviews the scientific literature on climate change subjects, produced studies on the increase of sea levels, and the IPCC shows very clearly that the increase of sea levels related to climate change will accelerate. And that is a fact. And from this acceleration, we'll very probably have the flooding of low altitude coastal areas and islands, making them less inhabitable or, in more serious cases, completely uninhabitable. The increase of sea levels brings a series of legal issues. Obviously, I'm not gonna go into details here on scientific issues or social issues, but I will concentrate on legal problems. I'll bring you 4 examples here. First, in maritime law, the increase of sea levels could provoke the change of the borders and basic lines of the jurisdiction of states. I think it is important to remind everyone that the baseline is a legal notion that is essential according to the UN Charter on Maritime Law, because all the areas under the state's jurisdiction are calculated based on this baseline. The tracing of this baseline has specificities according to the coast, if there are islands, if they are just the coast. But based on these lines, you will calculate the lines of jurisdiction of the states. And in a negative way as well, you also calculate the areas that are not under the state's jurisdiction. For example, the soils and the maritime floors, ocean floors, question that was raised by Minister Mauro Vieira, are also calculated in an opposite manner, because the maritime floors and is that which is not under the state's jurisdiction. And so this is based on the baselines and the other jurisdictions of the state. The increase of the sea levels can also affect the use of maritime resources by the states themselves, because it can affect the whole chain, the food chain, and many other ecologic aspects regarding the sea. And this increase can therefore produce a lack of living resources in certain parts of the sea. And then the issue of states themselves, where the states may disappear, have their territories reduced in a very significant manner sometimes. This is not a mere science fiction, but a true possibility according to IPCC studies, and something that we should and the law should fight against, especially because this brings a series of legal issues with specific consequences to human beings. There's also a series of consequences on the increase of sea level from the point of view of human rights. For example, the issue of the need of populations having to be relocated if their areas become uninhabitable. The problem of people becoming stateless, which could happen if a state completely disappears. And the rights of survival of communities that depend on the sea, especially because of the imbalances I mentioned previously that can take place because of the increase of sea level. Many riverside communities depend on fisheries or other and ocean activities can be affected by that. And a fourth element that is also related to legal consequences of the increase of sea level are those related to international responsibility. So basically, to know who caused the increase of the sea level and how should they respond for having caused that increase. In a way that if it is proved that someone caused or is linked to the increase of sea level, and this is a result of the climate change, this therefore could be considered as an international illegal action. And therefore, there's a whole apparatus of norms to be applied to the state or the states that could be linked to causing the increase of sea level. Well, as I mentioned, I really am very happy and really the honor being the Commission of International Law and Rights. And this commission, the ILC, the International Law Commission, finished this study now in 2025. But introducing the subject in international law has a very specific, peculiar history. Normally, they are started in the ILC by the members of the ILC itself. Formally speaking, it's always by the members. However, there are a few times where states provoke or make the ILC talk about something, and they can decide to include it or not after this provocation, so to speak. And the few cases where this happened, where the states provoked it, one of them was this on the increase of sea level. And I'm highlighting this factor because this shows the relevance of the subject and the fact of it having a existential question for the states. For example, states of Micronesia requested the General Assembly so that they could then hand over this request that the ILC could deal with that. In 2019, the International Law Commission included the subject and used a very specific model to deal with it. What model is this? Normally, the ILC studies and designates one rapporteur. He is the one who will take care of the subject and will present it to the commission to be discussed. But he or she would be the person who would lead the work. But in this case, we decided to use the methodology of a working group that would be presided by 5 members. And that would be a working group that any member of the ILC could choose to enter and participate. And I had the pleasure of being part of this work group. And this methodology is a methodology that is very ideal for subjects that have a multidisciplinary nature, that demand very specific approaches, and is exactly what happened. The working group presided by 5 members that each one would take care of one specific aspect of the problem. So the increase of the sea level in regards to international law. At the very beginning, the ILC decided to exclude certain subjects when dealing with it. And it's important to remind you here why it is that these subjects that were not part of the final report, even though some of them may be very relevant. This was decided especially to have a certain approach that would make the study viable, because there was a need that the study be finalized quickly. And the commission not, because there's a subject where the ILC has been discussing on for over 40 years studying, and this subject certainly could not take nearly that long. So they decided to exclude questions on protection to the environment, environmental protection, that are very relevant when you talk about sea level, but the climate change itself, to understand the legal apparatus that exists in regards to climate change, causality questions that would be really important to understand, for example, responsibility or international accountability, the rules themselves about international responsibility or accountability. For example, how do you establish an indemnization for the level of the ocean, and also proposed not to propose modification in the Convention of the UN for the change in sea level. Had a very clear idea that proposing this kind of thing would cause even problems, because the Convention on the Change of Sea Level would need the states to ratify the protocol with an amendment to the Convention. And so we also decided to not propose modifications in the UN Charter on Maritime Law. And so the Commission worked greatly on how this convention could be interpreted. It worked a lot on the convention's interpretation. Anyway, for those who are interested on the matter, basically all the subject matters, with the exception with the change of the convention, were dealt with the consultative opinions that I mentioned previously in the International Law Commission and International Courts, and in the Inter-American Human Rights Court as well, obviously geared towards the Americas reality. The Commission worked on this for 5 years, and the final report was produced this year. Since this conference about maritime law, I wanted to obviously concentrate on maritime law. So they decided on working on 3 subjects. I told you what they excluded, but it's obviously important to tell you what they included. They decided to work on the increase of the sea level from the point of view of maritime law, problems of states themselves, of countries, and human rights issues. I will not mention the 2 dimensions here, although I will briefly touch upon them at the end to talk about cross-cutting subjects, the intersection there is between maritime law and those of states themselves. But I will talk more about the increase of the sea level. So the 5 years that they dedicated to the subject, 2 of them were especially on maritime law in 2021 and all the way to 2023. And what did they study during this period? The effects of the sea level increase in the baselines and the external or exterior limits of the maritime spaces, also the space in the maritime borders and treaties. So what happens with the treaty? There's an international court that affects the authority that which was judged by the court. Brazil, for example, has 2 treaties with France, which is a treaty about the borders with French Guyana, and with Uruguay itself. The one from Uruguay is very old, it had some updates, but that of French Guyana is from the 90s. And so what happens, for example, Brazil suffers adverse consequences of sea level increase. And the treaty also dealt with the sovereign exercise and their jurisdiction on coastal areas and how this can affect third parties. That could happen. They might generate distortion in the baseline, and so the third state or third party as an area under their jurisdiction while the other one loses part of it. The Commission also dealt with the effects on islands, including artificial islands, as an answer to the increase of sea level, because this is already a reality. There are states that already use artificial structures to contain the sea that is advancing on the land. The concept of legal stability and mutability, intangibility of borders. The Commission also worked on the fundamental change of circumstances called the rebus sic stantibus, which would be the idea that the circumstances would change and therefore a treaty of borders, maritime borders, would have to change because of this fundamental state that has also changed. Situation where exclusive economic areas limited by this agreement are no longer able to be superimposed because of the change of the sea level. The so-called principle that the land dominates the ocean or the seas, which the International Court depends on for some of their decision. But this is a principle that was clearly discarded by the Commission in the sense that it wasn't really applied to the case of the sea level increase. Issues of equity, permanent sovereignty on natural resources. This is a fundamental principle, especially for the little island states, small island states that depend structurally on their own resources. How the increase of sea level could affect the right of the state itself, and furthermore, the right of collectivity of the population. That's which is of the permanent sovereignty on natural resource, and the possible losses and gains by third-party states, and the problem of nautical charters and safety for navigation, navigational safety.
Since the time doesn't allow, I'd like to go into the conclusions of the commission. I am available for any questions. I'm going to speak in a more general manner in what the commission, what conclusions they got to. Of course, these conclusions are the fruit of a very deep reflection. The principle of the land dominates the sea, it doesn't apply in this case, but there was a lot of discussion for this, for us to know that it didn't apply. So I will concentrate in the conclusions, but I am available to go into more details if necessary. A first conclusion, and repeating the issue that the convention of the Montego Bay Convention is a paradigm. That was the starting point that the Commission took. So the solutions had to be given from there, and that the Commission dealt a lot in terms of the subject of the raising of the sea level as a customary law. As many know, even though it's a convention that has a high level of ratification, it has 171 parties, but there are some states, some important in the scenario, that are not part of this convention. But even then, the Commission dealt with it as a paradigm. And I think that was adequate for the issues of the raising of the sea levels. Even the states that are not part of this commission, they deal as a customary law. Even they're not part, they follow it. And this would create international custom. So, and the convention, even though it's a paradigm, it is from 82. Of course, the Commission tried an interpretation that was teleological to seek the objective. What was the finality or the end of the convention in terms of getting answers? So the idea is to interpret this convention in order to favor legal stability and predictability. And in the report of this commission, three words will come in an exhaustive manner. But it seems it is very important that it be exhaustive in its repetition. 6, 7 times the same structures: legal stability, certainty, and predictability. The convention has to be read from these principles. And the idea of stability and predictability. So one interpretation that would lead to changing the baselines and the higher levels of the maritime level could create a situation of deep, deep inequality, favoring third parties in and in detriment of the coastal countries. And this is important because the coastal countries, which are the ones who will lose most, that the baselines can change with the changes in sea levels, are the small island states that didn't give cause, minimal, almost insignificant to climate change, but they are the ones that suffer most on the results of climate change. So this interpretation that is almost a value, these ideas of legal stability, certainty, and predictability, they are not only, they're not mechanical, dogmatic, or because they're of legal technique, they are valorative. So to not read it in that way would create distortions. So the Commission got to the conclusion that there is no device in the Convention that makes the states obliged to update their lines. Once deposited with the Secretary General of the UN, according to the Convention of the Sea, because they are by part, the Convention establishes obligation for the states to publish certain nautical charts with the Secretary General of the UN. So from there, they can establish the calculus of the exterior further limits that they have rights. So the Commission said that there is no obligation by the state of updating. So what does that mean in practice? Even if the raises and that jet changes the baselines, the state doesn't have to update their nautical charts, which means that they can keep their baselines. The Commission just made an alert, and of course this is important, that this non-updating or that it does not generate problems for international navigation. Certain changes in certain areas could be a problem for safety issues in terms of shipping and navigation. We discussed a lot within the Commission that there are many manners to alert the states of certain geographical accidents, alerting for issues of maritime navigation without having to update their nautical charts. They can set specific alerts, and they could determine maps about geographical accidents to make viable navigation. The Commission said if there isn't an obligation to update, there isn't to update their nautical charts. These issues are even related. The baseline has to be agreed upon on a charter. So the Commission tried to be comprehensive and ample, not even the obligation to update those lines, and or the charts that explain how these baselines are and how they are done. So it seems that the Commission took out this conclusion from the customs, because even the states that are not part of the convention do not have that obligation. As regards the conclusions, what is important to remember that the Commission didn't prohibit the state from preserving the current baselines. This is important because the preservation measures have many times to do with adaptation measures of the state, like construction of artificial structures to contain the advance of the sea, or islands when you have flooding of a territory. You can build artificial islands around an island in order to preserve the territory that existed before. So preservation or conservation is very important in our report because besides not updating those nautical charts and those baselines, the state doesn't that it conserve these current baselines. It has to do a lot with these adaptation measures. And another important and since there are some Pacific islands here, the International Commission that there is ample support between the states in general of the international community on a declaration that is very important from 2021 of the Pacific Islands on preserving maritime zones due to the increase of the sea level and climate change. The Commission said that in practice, that if this declaration, which is a regional declaration, has the support of the international committee, it, of course, it said with other words, that this is a possible regional practice that became more ample. It started regionally with some states, and then it became more universal. So what is it important for the future? That other instruments that can be done in the forum, the Pacific Island, they can also gain this universality. So there is possible that there be a deepening from new declarations in issues on in sea levels rising that we do not visualize that can be made universal to gain a practically an obligatory aspect in general. And finally, the Commission said that the rebus sic stantibus principle does not apply with maritime borders. This was important. We discussed this subject to get to a very simple conclusion. And also, the Commission said clearly that the preservation of the baselines is in conformity with the permanent sovereignty of natural resources. That is also an important conclusion, like I've mentioned before, the survival of various coastal communities, even a whole state, depends in measures, preservation measures of those baselines. And finally, I will speak very quickly, I know time is short, on the intersectional themes. The Commission dealt of states, human rights, but at the end of its report said, when the themes interact. First, the Commission said that the preservation of zones and titles is connected to the economic well-being and the condition of the population in the present and in the future. This is a human rights dimension that is important. Second, the stability and the certainty and predictability serve a series of things for the preservation and their power, as well as the continuity of the state and the self-determination of people. That is a right that is forecast. The sovereignty over natural resources, the protection of the population, and even of the peace and international security, and to avoid conflicts. The increase in sea levels is so serious that it talks about peace and security at the international level. So it is of the interest of the international community to keep those baselines of these areas. The equity of the equity, especially the states that didn't give cause of the climate to suffer its more adverse effects. Another important data, we emphasize the duty of the cooperation. It's not an option to cooperate. Of course, there are many ways to cooperate, but it is a duty. The state cannot stay inert and impassive to this problem. And finally, the Commission spoke that the legal interpretation, the legal hermeneutics, in terms of the increase of the sea level, has to take into account the needs of the states that are most affected by climate change. And coming to the end of my presentation, I would like to talk about the impact of the final report. Even though the final report was ended in May or June of this year, it has already had a concrete impact, and I'd like to mention the constructive opinion of the International Court of June of this year that mentions expressly the final report and confirms many of the conclusions. Why is this important? The recognition by the International Court gives a greater authority, and it is possible that this be called upon in the future by states in other international conflicts, using even customary laws. So what was defined by the Commission can be used as a normative legal parameter in the future. So as not to read, there are some parts that are being mentioned, but basically the court highlighted 3 points. Firstly, that in fact, that there isn't an obligation by the states of updating their nautical charts that shows their baselines or the outside limits of which the state has jurisdiction on that area. So this was an important data because it means that there is a recognition of, and this interpretation, that there isn't this obligation of updating the nautical chart. Second, the court also said that the increase of the sea level is not without consequence of the self-determination. That is not without consequence. It is not without consequences. So in both ways, there was a connection with the increase in sea levels. And I once more like to highlight that self-determination of the people is a human right. It is recognized in the Pact of Cultural Law Rights. And it's to talk about climate litigation. I know Chief Justice Herman is studies. It is possible that this argument of violation of human rights be used when there is sea increase. And the fact that the court recognized this is very important. And finally, the court also recognized, and this seems very important, the legal obligation, the duty to cooperate. The states have the duty to cooperate as regards rising sea levels. So I'd like to end my presentation, apologizing for going on so long, but I'd like to highlight 3 points. The final report of the International Commission of Law, in terms of of the laws of the sea, it is centered in stability, legal stability, predictability, and certainty. And I'd like to highlight that this is not only legal technique issue. There is a value in these words, especially as regards the protection of the states that are most affected. And in this point, the Commission of International Law Commission was very direct. Every time they produce a study, they produce their report, they have partial reports. This 2025 was the final report. All of these reports are discussed in the sixth commission of the General Assembly of the UN that happens in October. It's happening now. And every time the Commission produces one of these partial reports, it seems that there was a strong convergence in what the states were saying in their speeches for these three terms: stability, predictability, and certainty. Sometimes the conditions of states were a little bit different from what they took from these principles, but all of them were clearly favorable to these ideas. So here we have a product from the International Commission based on the practices of the states, how they see this issue. And this conclusion was so much based in customary practices that they didn't have any difficulty in saying that there isn't any obligation of the states to update their nautical charts. Basically, they were saying, look, I can see what the states think. Second, the final report took specially in consideration the interests of the states that are to be most effective, like the small island states. And here, equity has a crucial role. And if you allow me, Chief Justice Benjamin, an exercise of futurology, it seems that the problem of equity will have a essential role. The thinking about equity and production of injustice for the states that are less responsible will have an important role, and the courts, be internal and external, will be called to take out many of the consequences of the idea of equity. And finally, the study as a whole stimulated the state practice to the point that their conclusions were recognized by the International Law Commission. And this is important because this commission works in themes from a practice of the states.
States have their positions, and then the commission is going to try and put together these positions. What happened on this subject was the opposite. The commission elaborated the partial reports, and this stimulated the states to give their positions on the subject. For example, on the sixth commission of the General Assembly of the UN, such a way that when in 2025, the subject started in 2019, but when 2025 the subject finished or ended, nowadays we have a huge quantity of state practices. And this was definitely stimulated by the study of the IPCC. And once more, this result, that was a result of 5 years of work, and the states manifesting themselves on them, was finally recognized by the International Justice Court itself. So nowadays we have, in fact, a heritage in legal knowledge on the increase of sea level, and it seems to me that the ILC really did their job in that sense. So thank you very much. I'd like to thank Professor Galindo. His exposition was particularly in depth.
Speaker is American, Professor Simi Payne. But before I introduce her, I would like to emphasize one or two points that were made by Professor Galindo in his intervention. As we know, basic human rights are usually associated with the right to be in the political arena, in the social arena. Nowadays, within the context of climate change, we have to take one step back. And it's not just anymore the right to be or rights associated with status or to be, but the right to exist in all dimensions. This this aspect is particularly relevant for small island states that are living under the risk of disappearing, or at least its territorial dimension being submerged by water. So it's a very different perspective. It's not just a repeat, not just anymore about how to be in our societies, but way back how to exist and the right to exist. I think this is a critical point in your intervention. The other point that we should not forget, in spite of the Latin expression, is, it was also mentioned by you, is the rebus sextantibus. And again, that's one of the beauties of law. Rebus sextantibus dies in one area of law or in some areas of law, and it explodes in other areas of law. Here, we want to contain rebus sextantibus because it plays against the most vulnerable and increase the risk and to the detriment of the weaker party. But if you move to private law, and especially to consumer law, it's quite the opposite. And even environmental law, the permitting system. We want a permit to be based on the rebus sextantibus. We give you a permit to do something that affects the environment, but if the circumstances change, and in respect to the environment, it's changing all the time, including the scientific knowledge about that particular natural resource, then rebus sextantibus come in order to make something that in the past, recent past, was considered tight. Now, this is flexible, and we can even revoke a permit that was given to a particular economic activity that we thought it was safe. And then suddenly we discovered, no, it's not that safe, or at least the mitigation actions were not enough. So just to highlight this, for those that don't work with law, this sounds almost like a paradox or it's bizarre, but that's the way it is in life. In medicine is the same, you know, something that is a poison can, depending on the how much you use, can be a medicine. In law is something similar. Professor Simi Payne is one of the stars in this debate, and I'm a big admirer of her work, her dedication, her academic credentials. Is someone that has deep expertise, but at the same time, expertise that comes illuminated by the ethical values that are here with us in this debate. She is recognized globally. She has participated intensively and intensely, I could say, in the recent discussion in the Law of the Sea court in Hamburg, and we asked her to do an almost impossible task, which is to read the two opinions together and give us an overview and the points of contact, the points of overlap, but perhaps, and I have not done that exercise, the difference between both normative or jurisprudential of the approaches used by one court and the other. You have the floor.
Well, it is a tremendous honor to speak to this distinguished audience. Justice Benjamin, Minister, Ambassador, honorable judges, distinguished members of the diplomatic corps, ladies and gentlemen. My theme today is, as Justice Benjamin just said, a rather expansive one, and I'm going to take the academic privilege of saying some of this will be meat for another paper in the future. I'd like to begin with the advisory opinion of the International Tribunal for the Law of the Sea, which most directly and comprehensively addresses the marine environment, although it does not speak to the very important issue of sea level rise, which Professor Galindo has just addressed so effectively. I'll then comment on the ICJ advisory opinion, highlighting some of these points of overlap and some area where the ICJ goes further than the tribunal. And I'll just make a comment about some of the references that I'll make, especially since this may help interpretation. So the International Tribunal for the Law of the Sea in Hamburg, I will sometimes refer to as ITLOS, or the Tribunal, and the International Court of Justice, which sits in The Hague and has general jurisdiction over with international law, I'll refer to sometimes as the court and the ICJ. And I hope that won't be too confusing. So as Justice Benjamin told us in his opening remarks this morning, the ocean provides us with innumerable ecosystem services, and it's valuable in and of itself. It comprises 70% of Earth's surface and 95% of its habitable space. It's absorbed 90% of the excess heat and 30% of the excess carbon generated by greenhouse gas emissions from human activities. Yet these emissions also damage ocean ecosystems with warming, deoxygenation, and acidification, and sea level rise, putting these protective functions at risk. Ocean life itself is crucial to the ocean's carbon sequestration function. It's an integrated system. So how did this come to the Law of the Sea Tribunal in the first place? The Commission of Small Island States on Climate Change and International Law, with the acronym of COSIS, these are 6 of the most climate vulnerable states, which Professor Galindo has so effectively described for us, the risks that they're facing. These were Antigua and Barbuda, Niue, Palau, St. Lucia, Tuvalu, and Vanuatu, as a kind of David and Goliath, leveraging international law to level the policy playing field for climate change. The COSIS submission to the Law of the Sea Tribunal stated international law must play a critical role in ensuring the collective survival of humankind. And COSIS intended for the tribunal to identify obligations that are legally binding rather than discretionary. They asked it to define with greater precision the specific obligations under the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea with respect to climate change on the basis of established scientific evidence. And here, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC, was the touchstone for both the submissions, most of the submissions to the tribunal, and for the tribunal's ultimate advisory opinion. The questions asked for an interpretation of the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, which I might refer to as the Convention or UNCLOS, and I believe it's referred to as CUDLOS in Portuguese. So the convention was, as Professor Galindo noted, negotiated and adopted during the period that gave birth to environmental law. And we see this in the text, a kind of future vision that could be applied to the relatively new problem of climate change. In 1982, there was an understanding that climate change was a phenomenon that was happening, that it posed a great risk. But it's not mentioned specifically in the convention because it wasn't clear exactly how that would play out. So it didn't become a subject of the convention itself. Part 12 of the convention addresses protection of the marine environment, and it introduced strong, legally binding commitments to prevent, reduce, and control pollution of the marine environment from any source, including terrestrial sources, and to protect and preserve the marine environment. So this is the fundamental basis for the advisory opinions analysis. The convention also recognizes certain economic freedoms of the seas, obligations to cooperate, and this is again a through line from the International Law Commission work that you've just heard about to both the ICJ and the ITLOS advisory opinions, this obligation to cooperate. But also it includes obligations to have due regard for other states' interests and rights when a state is exercising its own rights, and obligations to increase the capacity of states that have less capacity. The opinion itself was issued in May of 2024, so a little over a year ago. And it, of course, addressed the first two thresholds that judges have to consider, jurisdiction and admissibility. And then there was a second step that was the question of whether the court would accept jurisdiction. It is discretionary for the Law of the Sea Tribunal in the case of advisory opinions. So there were real questions about whether the International Tribunal for the Law of the Sea would even take this request for an advisory opinion. It did. And then the next question was, does UNCLOS have anything to say about this subject? And that had to be an analysis of Article 1 of the convention. Are greenhouse gases pollutants under the convention? The answer was yes. Careful but straightforward analysis of the text led to that conclusion. And I think it's worth realizing that now we've had the International Law Commission report, we've had the ICJ opinion, we've had the Inter-American Court of Human Rights opinion on climate change, and a number of other regional courts have spoken. But when the Law of the Sea Tribunal was developing its opinion, it really was the first. And it was bold in that sense because its conclusions were in line with a larger vision of what international law is and what it can mean for a future on this planet undergoing such tremendous stress. So let me turn to what the court actually said. So the tribunal set the tone by saying that climate change represents an existential threat and raises human rights concerns. It presented the IPCC conclusions on climate change impacts on the marine environment. It recognized the necessity of limiting temperature increases to 1.5 degrees centigrade above pre-industrial levels without overshoot, saying the global temperature goal and the timeline for emission pathways set forth in the Paris Agreement are particularly relevant. That is, net zero greenhouse gas emissions by about 2050. Importantly, the tribunal found that UNCLOS contains legal obligations to address climate change in parallel with and additional to the Paris Agreement. The climate change treaty regime is not lex specialis. UNCLOS applies, and its obligations are additional. And this is important because being a convention created, adopted at the time environmental law was being created, it is much stricter. It's got more stringent obligations than the more recent climate regime. And in fact, the tribunal said, and I quote, "The obligation under the convention would not be satisfied simply by complying with the obligations and commitments under the Paris Agreement, nor does the Paris Agreement modify or limit the obligation under the convention." It thus makes clear that states parties to the convention, which number 169 plus the European Union, that they have agreed to do more to meet their obligations under Paris. So I mentioned there were two articles that were key to this. Article 194 is uncompromising in its plain text in requiring states to take all necessary measures to prevent, reduce, and control pollution of the marine environment from any source. Note that this applies to all sources of greenhouse gases, not just those generated on the ocean, say by shipping, but from anywhere, including the most prevalent emissions, which are land-based. In other words, the drafters of the convention understood the connectivity between the land and the sea. The UNCLOS language is broad in its preamble, and in the second article that I referred to, Article 192, it requires states to conserve the ocean's living resources and to protect and preserve the marine environment. The tribunal underscored the importance of this, saying, well, Article 192 imposes upon states a legal obligation. This provision is, at the same time, a statement of principle upon which the legal order for the protection and preservation of the marine environment under the convention is based. There's a third article that's of interest. So Article 195, when states are implementing prevention, reduction, and control of greenhouse gases, Article 195 requires that they must avoid transferring damage or hazards from one area to another, or transforming one type of pollution into another. For example, marine geoengineering would be contrary to Article 195 if it has the consequence of transforming greenhouse gas pollution into another form of pollution. The tribunal acknowledges what it calls the reality that prevention of pollution from all sources at all times is in practice not possible, which softens to some extent the severity of the treaty text. But they point out that the application of this depends on the available means and capabilities of the states concerned. In complying with the Article 192 obligation, a strict standard of due diligence is required, given the high risk to the marine environment and to the planet posed by climate change and the urgency to act. And this requires states to adopt national legislation and administrative procedures to establish international rules and standards to prevent, reduce, and control greenhouse gas pollution. And that, of course, is another area requiring cooperation, which we hope we will see in Belém. It also requires enforcement and adequate vigilance to make such a system function efficiently with a view to achieving the objective. Global and regional cooperation are necessary, but are not enough it is not enough to simply participate in now this is another quote, it is not enough to simply participate in the global efforts to address the problems of climate change. Showing up in Bilim is not enough. States are required to take all necessary measures, including individual actions as appropriate. They have further obligations to protect and preserve the marine environment, including the duty to prevent or mitigate environmental harm and maintain ecosystem health and the natural balance of the marine environment. We know how important this is because we need to maintain the biophysical systems that continue to manage the planet's stability. And this calls for specific measures, such as the enactment and enforcement of laws, regulations, undertaking monitoring and assessment. This is where the Biodiversity Beyond National Jurisdiction Agreement provides both examples and specific obligations. And it was a delight to hear that Brazil is about to deposit its instrument of ratification. So states have to use environmental impact assessment. They have to consider cumulative impacts, and they have to consider how to mitigate and adapt to the adverse effects of emissions on the marine environment. Finally, the Law of the Sea Tribunal said if a state fails to comply with the legal obligation to take all necessary measures to prevent, reduce, and control marine pollution from anthropogenic greenhouse gas emissions, then international responsibility would be engaged for that state. The tribunal did not elaborate on that, but the ICJ does. My final couple comments on the tribunal before I move to the ICJ is that there was an equity in execution that was required. So the tribunal says states with greater means and capabilities must do more to reduce emissions, but all states must act. States with capacity must provide technical assistance to others. All states have important duties to undertake environmental assessment, to monitor their activities, to report the results. And Chief Judge Hoffman gave particular attention in his reading of portions of the opinion to include analysis of cumulative impacts, observing that an activity or effect may not be significant individually, but may with others cause significant harm. And he also suggested that socioeconomic impacts could be included in environmental impact assessment. Necessary measures should be determined objectively, not merely what states prefer. And my second comment on equity is that we saw an extraordinary equity and transparency in participation, an unprecedented number of states, 34 states, including Rwanda, a landlocked state that submitted its instrument, joined the convention the day it became a party to the convention. Several intergovernmental organizations, including International Union for Conservation of Nature, an organization that Justice Benjamin has made a tremendous contribution to, and 10 others submitted to the tribunal, and 35 states parties provided oral submissions. Now, turning to the International Court of Justice, and this will be a little briefer, the July 2025 opinion that you've already heard mentioned will be considered by many probably to be the most significant of the recent advisory opinions. And I think it's worth just noting that there is a wonderful chronological sequence here. So the International Tribunal for the Law of the Sea had its advisory opinion published last year. The International Law Commission's work on sea level rise, which was not fully addressed or barely referred to in the Law of the Sea Tribunal opinion, subsequently came out. And so you see international law building one step at a time until the International Court of Justice has seen what the Law of the Sea Tribunal said. It's seen what the International Law Commission said. And it is in general, and I haven't had time to nitpick through and see where there may be differences, but from my read of these opinions and reports, I would say that they build on each other and the International Court of Justice moves further. It takes some steps that go beyond the tribunals. So cooperation is a central theme across all of them. And in the ICJ opinion, that does include obligations to provide financial assistance, technology transfer, and capacity building. The opinion also offers new opinions for contentious legal cases between states affected by climate change harms and states whose greenhouse gas emissions have contributed the most to the problem by asserting that attribution is sufficiently advanced to allow determinations of causation and clarifying that a state can be in breach of its obligation to take measures to mitigate greenhouse gas emissions from private actors. State conduct in fossil fuel production and consumption, including granting of fossil fuel exploration licenses and subsidies, may constitute an internationally wrongful act attributable to the state, according to the International Court of Justice. A state that fails to regulate private actors by adopting measures to limit their emissions will be in breach of its international obligations. The ICJ found that the rules of state responsibility apply, which entails the consequences of the obligation to cease the wrongful behavior, to provide assurances that it won't be repeated, and to provide reparation. The controversial question of loss and damage is mentioned, and the court found that climate change obligations are owed both to the international community as a whole, erga omnes, and to other parties of particular treaties, erga omnes partes, offering a wide range of states that can invoke a breach of the obligation. Another important finding in the opinion, and a question not asked of the Law of the Sea Tribunal, is the material covered so effectively by Professor Galindo regarding sea level rise. And in response to the two questions about ambulatory baselines and continuity of statehood, the court basically said, not necessarily lost, leaving the further delineation of that to be developed, presumably through contentious cases, but referring with respect to the International Law Commission, consistent with that report. Like the Law of the Sea Tribunal, the ICJ found that obligations to control greenhouse gas emissions are obligations of conduct, not result, but because the Kyoto Protocol, the Paris Agreement, ICJ said, are the principal legal instruments regulating the international response to climate change. And their requirements for states to adopt mitigation and adaptation measures and to cooperate are obligations of conduct, but that there are obligations of result as well. Those obligations are for developed states to report on their greenhouse gas sources and sinks and control measures, and to prepare, for all states, to prepare, publish, and maintain and account for their nationally determined contributions. The content of the NDCs, the court said, is not discretionary or self-defined, but is subject to the highest standard of due diligence, that parties must do their utmost to collectively maintain a safe climate. Even states that are not parties to the climate treaties are required by customary international law to prevent significant harm to the environment by acting with due diligence, using all means at their disposal to prevent activities carried out within their jurisdiction or control from causing significant harm to the climate system and other parts of the environment in accordance with their common but differentiated responsibilities and respective capabilities, cooperating in good faith on sustained and continuous measures to prevent harm. So to conclude, I would suggest that the law of the Sea Tribunal, the International Court of Justice, advisory opinions don't give us a final answer to climate change, but they do give us more incentive to find answers. They remind us that the principles that nations believed were of great importance when they agreed to the relevant treaties and developed customary international law have meaning to us today. And it may give some powerful actors the courage to turn away from the dogma of economic growth to live within our planetary means. Thank you so much for your attention.
Thank you so much. I think we had two panoramic views of this very broad theme. Of course, there is still much more to cover. We now have time for comments, questions from the audience. If there are no questions or comments, then we move directly to the next panel, which is on the conservation sustainable use of oceans and marine resources. Any comment? Any question? This is a quiet audience. You know, you are in a court, but feel free to challenge views. If not, let's thank both Professor Galindo and Professor Payne for their extraordinary presentations. And we move directly to the next panel. For this panel, I invited as chair my colleague, Justice Paulo Sérgio Domingues, who in the court is the one that is most sensitive to ocean, because he is not just a scuba diver, but you know, I have to confess, I suffer from claustrophobia, and I admire very much the YouTube videos of scuba diving and all that. And then when he comes back from the most spectacular places in the world, after spending sometimes 2 weeks diving. So this is the best person really to share a panel in our event. Justice Paulo Sérgio started as a federal judge, and then he was appointed to the Federal Court of Appeals of the Third Circuit. It's considered the most, I'll not say important, but the one that has jurisdiction of the biggest and most powerful state, which is São Paulo and South Mato Grosso. And then he was appointed to the court by President Lula recently, 2 years ago. Yeah, 2 years ago. In fact, he was appointed by the previous government, but confirmed by the present administration. He's a former president of the Brazilian Association of Federal Judges. And again, when we were discussing this event, the first person that came to mind was Justice Domingues. You are the chair, so you move here, and I will invite the next panel. Dr. João Luiz Nicolodi, Director of Oceans and Coastal Management of the Ministry of Foreign of the environment. They are both co-chairing. And then the two guests of honor speakers are Dr. Tebatoki Tawetia, who is the Secretary of the Cabinet of the President of Kiribati, and Dr. Francilia Adiri, who is the legal consultant of Nauru. So please. Oh, okay. No, no, no. No, no. Vai, vamos encerrar aí na tua suíça.
Yeah.
So, good morning to everyone. It's a great pleasure to share these 8 moments with you. And I thank President Benjamin for this opportunity. You know how important, you all know how important is Mr. Benjamin's role in the construction, the development of the environmental jurisprudence in Brazil. His leadership is worldwide known, and for me it's a great pleasure to have the opportunity to be with you this morning in such an important event. I will only make a small remark after what he said, because as an old scuba diver, I can assure you that there is no claustrophobia in the ocean. Actually, that's the place where we can feel free at the most in the whole world. We will start. Well, we have this. We have Mr. Dr. Tebatoki Tawetia, Secretary of the Cabinet of the Presidency of Kiribati. It's a great pleasure to you, and I welcome also Dr. Francilia Adire, consultant of Nauru. Okay? But at first, I will share the word with Dr. João Luiz Nicolodi from the Ministry of Environment. Please.
Morning, everyone. I will speak in Portuguese. So, please take. Bom, em nome da ministra do Meio
In the
Ambiente
name of the Minister of the Environment, Marina Silva, I greet all the participants here at the event, the colleagues of the table here. It is a great pleasure to be participating in an event on this subject, on climate change, ocean,
numa casa do Superior Tribunal de Justiça
in the National High Court, involving colleagues from the executive branch, from the diplomatic corps, the academia. And I'm highlighting this because 15 years ago, this didn't used to happen. The discussion on climate change and oceans was restricted to the academic world, to the environmental area, and I see very gladly broadening of the scope of the discussion on this subject. I'm going to very quickly talk here about what we've been doing in the Ministry of Environment, how it's been dealing on climate change, specifically related to the ocean. And within this subject that I consider very relevant in the sense of having this participation and discussion, some questions are also already considered as a point that you have a consensus already, that it is the climate regulator of the planet. There's also a question a few years ago was still being much discussed, and this is now pretty much clear. Then I go back to this on the regulating role of the ocean. For the last 2 years, where there's a data series that measured the temperature of the ocean that have been indicating a surprising increase. There is a tendency of temperature increase. These are data from the IPCC. I'm talking about temperature and not level, the temperature of the ocean, and that in 2023 and 2024 really beat the record on temperature increase. And this temperature increase has terrible effects on the ecosystems. The biggest example is the coral reefs. The death of the coral reefs, the whitening of the coral reefs, where these 2023 and 2024 events already have brought a world scenario that's really not great in regards to the death of coral reefs, where we already reached about 70% of coral reefs in the world whitening that is not only linked to ocean temperature, but very much connected to it. And I'm not talking just about the ocean, but of global warming as a whole, of the prolonged effect. It's already been talked about here somehow. But even if we stopped emissions completely now, today, we would still have the effect, the increase of the sea level, for example, for many years. So this takes us to a basic question, which is the focus of the action of the Ministry of Environment, which is adaptation. Obviously, the Ministry of Environment follows very closely the subjects relative to the phenomenon itself, a series of historical data, IPCC reports, but from an executive point of view, we're very much more focused on an adaptation. So we have this scenario, it's here, what can we do to adapt to it? And so some information that we have considered really relevant. 1 centimeter of sea level increase means an intrusion or an increase. So a vertical increase of the sea level means a whole meter of horizontal advance of the sea onto the land. Sometimes you look at the data, the sea level increase 1 centimeter. 1 centimeter is this, it's like nothing. But this represents a whole meter of horizontal advance of the water onto the beaches. So in 2023, we have 10.1 centimeters, which is about 10 meters of loss of land, of horizontal advance of the sea. And this horizontal action is increased by the wave. What erodes a beach or makes it disappear is not just the level of the sea, but is the action of the wave, which has an exponential effect from its energy. A 1 meter wave has, let's say, X effect of energy on the beach. A 2 meter wave has 4 times that power on the beach. And so if we have 10 centimeters of sea level increase, that's 10 meters more where the wave is going to affect the land. And we already have a scenario that is already considered a climate emergency. Of course, compared to our colleagues here, our invitees of the island states, specifically the emergency situations even greater, as has already been mentioned. I'm sure they're going to mention themselves. But Brazil's also going through a climate emergency. I mentioned the coral reefs. So there's about 70%, no, it's 84% of the coral reefs in the world are already suffering some kind of impact because of this increase of the temperature. That is really important. Just so you can have some information, Brazil has already lost 15% of the beaches. 15% of the beaches have disappeared, considering a 40-year data series, because of these phenomena that we're mentioning here. Has lost 15% of the beaches, and I believe 40 and 50%, or half of them, are under some kind of erosion process. And it's important to say that the erosion process in the Brazilian beaches are all over the world are very much connected to the sea level rise, but not just that. Real estate speculation, lack of planning also contribute to it, and this tendency, and I'm talking about society and humans as a whole now. Here in Brazil, we say it's living with one foot on the beach or the sand is the worst thing you could possibly see in planning wise for a coastal area. Because one foot on the sand now could mean 10 years later, the waves actually beating on your front door. We need to look at the fact that beaches are movable. They're part of a process that obviously gets worse from the point of view of speaking about sea level rise, but ever since the planet has existed, we have the sedimentary adjustment of the beaches, obviously made worse by what we're discussing here. And so when we're talking about this 15% of beach erosion, 15% of the beaches have disappeared and 40% under erosion process, we must understand that it is a question of sea level increase, of climate change, but not just that. Oh, for an example, the metropolitan area of Recife, the Boa Viagem beach, is under an intense erosive process, not just because of the sea level, but it has a lot to do with the bad occupation of these spaces. Also, the Ministry of the Environment in 2023 was a big year because the first time since the ministry was created, which was in 92, by José Stenberg, one of the biggest environmentalists of the history of Brazil, since 92, that the ocean and coastal areas reached a status of department of the ministry. This is important. This shows how much of a priority the agenda is. And the copy itself, which is starting now in, is an example of that. If we look at the previous COPs, the ocean has always been a secondary subject, and this is a process that has been increasing, and that brings to the copy of Belém the ocean as the protagonist itself. This is interesting, and in the Ministry of the Environment, as I mentioned, 2023, from part of this department, we brought this protagonism to it. And I'm quickly going to talk about some of the points that we've been dealing with in a more specific way. For example, the World Conference of Oceans that occurred in June of this year, Brazil presented 3 voluntary engagements. One to cooperate permanently on solutions based on the ocean with the agenda biodiversity, to reinforce the commitment that at least 30% of the Brazilian economic zone be covered by protected sea areas. And as Rear Admiral said here, the coordination, the sea and ocean area, which is done with the Ministry of Environment as well, so that until 2030 we can have the planning of maritime area implemented and put into practice in Brazil. We have the climate plan that's been discussed since 2023, that is in the final phase of implementation, is divided between the climate plan, between mitigation and adaptations. We've been working a lot on the adaptation plan, that is sectorial, and one of the sectors is oceans and coastal areas, and some specific programs from my department, which is the Pro-Mangrove program, which is a program for recovery and protection of the specific ecosystem, instituted by the Decree 1205 last year, the Pro-Coral program, established in Decree 1284 in June of this year, just a little bit before the UNOC, and the last one, which is Ocean Without Plastic, which is one of the big problems in the world, the plastic pollution of ocean, to Decree 12644 of the 1st of October of this year. And finalizing 2 other main actions that we have in regards to this subject: the process of border management, so integrated management of the coastal areas are coordinated by the Ministry of Environment, but has its main collegiate within the CERM, the coastal management and the maritime spatial planning that has within one of its prerogatives the idea of being an instrument to fight or at least to deal with climate questions regarding the ocean. I would like to talk about this general panorama so that we can tell you how we're working on this in the Ministry of Environment. I am at your disposal here should you have any doubts or questions and anything you'd like to talk about. And I hope that from this seminary and this conversation and from the COP itself, to be able to establish some kind of joint action with island states that are going through this climate emergency so that we can act jointly, especially on this subject on adaptation to climate change, which is the main focus, main action that we have in the Ministry of Environment. Thank you very much.
I thank Dr. João Nicolodi. And I take also the opportunity to congratulate you and all people at the ministry for this work of reconstruction you were doing in the last years at the environmental ministry. So now I'll give the floor to our speakers. First, Dr. Batoki Tawetia, and then later, Dr. Fricilia Adir. Dr. Tebatoki, have the floor for 20 minutes.
Thank you. Sorry, yeah. I'm humbled by the praise you gave me. I'm not yet a doctor, but thank you for the honor. Excellencies, distinguished guests, friends, ladies and gentlemen, I bring you warm greetings from the people of Kiribati, whom I have the honor to represent at this crucial juncture. And in his holy name, and greetings to you all. First and foremost, I extend our profound appreciation to the government and the people of Brazil for the extraordinary warmth hospitality received. We applaud your leadership in convening this vital assembly. Brazil understands the ocean's fate is interwoven with every corner of the world. This space for genuine dialogue on the international law of the sea and the sustainable use of our marine resources is very crucial. I am profoundly honored to deliver this statement of experience on behalf of the government and the people of Kiribati on the subject central to our survival. It's supposed to be existence, but we don't normally like to use the word existence. We rather say survival. Conserving and sustainably using the oceans, seas, and marine resources. For Kiribati, the ocean is not just a vast body of water between islands. It is the very foundation of our statehood, our own and our identity. We like to call ourselves the people of the sea. So when we speak of the ocean, we speak of one, our culture and identity. We are navigators and fishing people. To harm the ocean is to erase who we are. Two, our economy and food security. Our tuna stocks, managed sustainably, account for more than 70% of government revenue. It pays for our children's schools, our hospitals, and our sovereign future. This is why the fight against illegal, unreported, and unregulated fishing is a daily critical battle. It is the theft from our children and our economic wealth. Third, our survival. With our islands sitting just meters above sea level, saltwater intrusion caused by climate change is affecting our freshwater and eroding our lands. When the ocean is sick, Kiribati is in crisis. These deeply intertwined values of our ocean is what compels us to lead as custodians of our vast blue space, in line with the 2050 strategy for the Pacific continent. Today, this life-giving ocean faces unprecedented threats. We, the people of Kiribati, stand on the front lines of this global crisis, carrying disproportionate and unfair burden. Pollution is harming our marine life ecosystems. The Pacific carpet patch and alarming rate of marine plastics continues to expand, degrading integrity and threatening the very health of our ocean. Illegal, unreported, and unregulated fishing overexploit our shared tuna stocks, disrupting fragile food webs and undermining our effort towards sustainability. The escalating impact of climate change, rising seas, intensifying storms, warming oceans, and deacidification are all combining to relentlessly squeeze the resilience abilities of our delicate atolls and marine ecosystems. However, early this year, we came together in Nice, in France, to talk about SDG 14 goals and solutions to our shared ocean challenges. We must not forget the clear message sent at the UN Ocean Conference in Nice, in France. The Nice Ocean Action Plan was a victory of multilateralism, setting a collective promise of urgency. For small island developing states, the outcome of Nice was not abstract goals, they were survival necessities, or they were existential necessities. We welcome the strong commitment to accelerate action for sustainable development goal number 14, and those commitments must now guide our global action plan. If we are to truly conserve and sustainably use our marine resources, we must focus our collective energy on the following interconnected actions that demand global accountability. First, we must uphold the rule of law and secure sovereignty. We must ensure the good governance of the ocean. This starts with enforcing the UNCLOS and pushing for the swift entry into force of the BBNJ agreement. Secondly, and crucially, we call on the global community to honor the commitment to uphold the rights and responsibilities derived from the convention, specifically the permanence of existing maritime zones. This is a non-negotiable bedrock for the continuity of statehood, the protection of our resources, and global justice for small island developing states. Thirdly, we need to achieve balance through strategic marine planning. We must strike a balance between conservation and sustainable economic development. The tool to achieve this is marine spatial planning. This innovative management approach will allow us to meet our collective goal of 30% global ocean protection by 2030, while ensuring that fishing and maritime transport still support economic growth, food security, and job creation for our people. Fourthly, to deliver climate justice. We cannot talk about ocean restoration without demanding climate action. The rising temperature of the atmosphere directly translates into a hotter, more acidic and higher ocean. We call on all nations to honor the commitment to limit warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius and to fully operationalize and support the vulnerable through the loss and damage fund. The health of our islands and our oceans requires immediate and comprehensive restoration. We need to invest in capacity, innovation, and people. The responsibility for our ocean governance is immense and requires resources. We must ratchet up the capacities needed by small and developing states in science, in monitoring, and in enforcement. We need innovation and technologies that allow us to manage our resources effectively and build a resilient blue economy for the future. Excellencies, Kiribati values the ocean not just as a resource to be harvested, but as a living entity that is our identity and our future. We stand ready to work with you. We do not ask for pity, we ask for partnership and the political will to act. The ocean connects every nation, every people, and every destiny. The choices we make today will decide whether our children will inherit an ocean of life or a legacy of profound loss. Let us leave this forum with renewed purpose and the concrete actions needed to secure a healthy, prosperous, and peaceful ocean for all. I thank you. Ambassador.
Muito bem, eu gostaria de passar a palavra agora.
Okay, very well. I'd like to hand over to Dr. Francilia Adiri, legal consultant of Nauru.
Thank you, Deputy Director of Oceans. I was just going through the program.
Eu estava passando pelo programa e acho que perdemos a parte mais importante, que era o coffee break. Então, eu vou tentar manter a minha intervenção breve.
Said all protocols observed. Distinguished Justice Paulo, the Deputy Director of Oceans. Apologies, I'm not able to pronounce the names. This is my first time in Brazil. Ambassador Susan, like my colleague from Budapest, I am also humbled by the doctor title. However, I am still pursuing such a status, so not there yet. Anyway, I bring you warm greetings from Nauru, and I am honored to address this distinguished forum on behalf of His Excellency David Allen, the President of Nauru, who regrets deeply not being able to attend himself, as well as the people of Nauru. We find this platform as an opportunity for advancing global commitment to the, as my colleague has also highlighted, the blue economy, as well as fulfilling the SDG 14. Nauru shares these commitments deeply as our future depends on the sustainable management of our ocean resources. So we too would like to commend the government of Brazil, in particular its Ministry of Foreign Affairs, as well as the Superior Court of Justice for organizing this timely event. Nauru further conveys its sincere gratitude for inviting us to not only get a chance to visit Brasília, even though it's just a short brief visit, but also to contribute to this vital platform. And so, like I said, it is my privilege to offer Nauru's perspectives and insights on this important topic. And the topic that I'm discussing is to conserve and sustainably use the oceans, seas, and marine resources. Just for context, I wanted to take you back in time to a critical chapter in Nauru's history. And I see this as a story of resilience and renewed hope in the ocean as well as its resources. For decades, As you all know, phosphate mining is the backbone of our economy. It supported livelihoods as well as our national development. In the late 1990s and early 2000s, Nauruans went from some of the highest incomes in the world to struggling to afford daily essentials. With the money gone, imported food, it became a luxury for us. Many jobs disappeared and incomes plunged. Some workers earn $50 or less per month, many none at all. So the impact was very severe, especially for a nation that has grown long accustomed to a relative comfort. During this harsh time or struggling time, a remarkable phenomenon unfolded, something that the people today still talk about. And it seemed like the ocean, it responded to the island's need. People witnessed unusual large schools of fish washed up on the beach, or were even more easily catchable. For some, it felt like the sea itself was helping them survive when everything else failed. I don't know, perhaps it was luck or natural shift. Perhaps there was a scientific explanation. However, these were the collective memory and the storytelling from that period. And so for many in Nauru, it felt almost providential, a small miracle that the ocean provided when all else was lost. That memory, it actually changed the way Nauruans view their marine environment. The ocean became more than a resource for enjoyment. It became our source of survival and our hope. It's a true lifeline. Though that period was a struggle, it was, it could be looked as a blessing in disguise as well, because it led people to rediscover something that they had long forgotten, and a powerful reminder that if the ocean goes, there won't be anything left to fall back on. So this lived experience renewed a fundamental understanding. The ocean must be both protected and used sustainably. It cannot be one or the other. This balance that's championed globally by the blue economy, it reflects the pathway to economic resilience, ecological stewardship, and social well-being. It took an economic crisis, I guess, for Nauru to renew its conviction about the significance of the ocean and its resources. And it is a lesson that we believe the world must learn. Because for Nauru, when other resources fail, the ocean answered. And as we often say, when we had little, the sea provided. Too often, discussions about ocean governance presents a false choice to us. Conservation versus development, environmental protection versus economic rights. For example, the third UN Ocean Conference political declaration, it devotes nearly twice as many paragraphs to conservation aspirations as it does to sustainable ocean-based economies. It was a challenging process, and I was part of that negotiation of that document. Now, this reveals a flawed perspective, if I could say, that can cloud our approach. So just to simply put that, my main message today is this: conservation and sustainable use can and must coexist, provided a balance exists between them. These goals, they are not conflicting. Instead, they complement each other. Finding this balance is essential to achieving the ambitions of SDG 14 in advancing the blue economy, not just for Nauru, but for all, especially our future generations. In highlighting this, there are three pillars that are drawn from this balanced approach. One, first, is conservation, and as highlighted, conservation and development must go hand in hand. Protecting marine ecosystems is essential and non-negotiable. However, governance must also support developing rights to sustainably use marine resources for food security, economic growth, and poverty reduction. These are the principles that lie at the core of the blue economy that many of the Pacific Island nations are advocating for. Second, as my colleague also highlighted, capacity building and equity. These are crucial foundations. For us, there is a need for technology transfer, financial support, long-term partnerships, and capacity development to help us fully engage in ocean governance, whether within or beyond our national waters. Just to put it differently, as my colleague stated, we are not asking for charity. This is essential for a fair and effective stewardship. I mean, it's unreasonable to expect the smaller island developing nations to shoulder conservation burdens without equitable access to benefits and resources. Third, the climate and ocean nexus. This demands integrated action. Sustainable ocean management and climate action are, to us, inseparable. Ocean warming, acidification, and shifting currents are reshaping marine ecosystems worldwide. For conservation to succeed and for vulnerable states to adapt and thrive, major emitters must commit to deep emissions reductions, which, we've been calling for this for several years. So recognizing and addressing this link is, I guess, critical for the future of our oceans and communities. Together, these three pillars offer a balanced framework that we think protects the ocean while supporting sustainable development in line with today's topic. And how we put these into action is, I'll just name a couple. And these are, we advocate for international ocean law reforms that recognize conservation and development as equally important, supporting area-based management tools while ensuring equitable benefit sharing for developing nations, promoting sustainable fisheries management combined with technology transfer and capacity building to empower our small island states, advocate for climate action while also securing support for adaptation measures and safeguarding development rights, engaging in ocean resource governance frameworks that uphold strong environmental standards alongside fair development rights. I must acknowledge that some see the balance as watering down environmental protections. We do not agree with this. We strive for a framework that upholds strong safeguards while ensuring fair sharing of both burdens and benefits when development needs are ignored. And so when communities lack the alternative, what is the last option? Illegal exploitation follows. Now, therefore, we continue to embrace ocean governance that is built on balance. Not conservation versus development, not environmental protection versus economic rights, but rather conservation alongside development, protection combined with equity, climate action together with development rights. Our vision for ocean governance is, in short, grounded on balancing the conservation and sustainable use of the ocean, seas, and marine resources. That kind of ends my presentation, but as clearly, I did not attempt to speak on the legal nuances of the topic, especially in this esteemed court and amongst its members whose mandate are essentially to do such interpretation. So I don't want to venture into that area. However, I wanted to recall the earlier comments made from our first panelists on exploring the ethical dimension of responsibilities and encourage that such exploration consider also helping us in the Pacific realize what is promised to us under UNCLOS, which includes Article 148, which is for the effective participation of developing states. With that, I thank you, Mata Bakar.
Thank you very much, Dr. Brasília Adir. I think we still have time for some comments, questions. Quem gostaria de fazer alguma pergunta? Temos algum tempo.
Who would like to ask any questions or comments?
Estamos falando com quem está ali no
We are talking to those
aumento dos oceanos.
of the rising sea levels already hitting their front door. So this is an important opportunity.
Doutora Susan, gostaria de...
Dr. Susan, thank you. Firstly, I'd like to thank you all for your participation as panelists and as public. I would like, in terms of the COP30 being the current subject, I'd like to ask two questions to Professor Galindo. First, of economic nature. If the International Court of Justice are dealing with the current case of exploring rare earth in these Pacific islands, as these islands might have changed their original dimension, if there's an ongoing court case and how it was being dealt. And second is more political, which is the new legal or geographic configuration in the Pacific, especially in the South China Sea, with the creation of islands and a new geographic situation. How is this being dealt? And if you could comment on that, thank you. Thank you, Madam Ambassador. As regards your second question, not that I know, maybe our speakers can give us more information. Currently, there isn't any case with this specific issue you mentioned, but though, as I mentioned in my presentation, I believe that it is possible that with these recent decisions, especially these consultations, that they new legal cases might show up. And there is a very big movement, especially by non-government organizations, certain results that cannot be done through negotiations. Sometimes legal aspects as being negative, especially in Brazil, we associate litigation with the idea that a politicization of the judiciary branch, but it is important to think in how these courts can be a field that is very important for demands that they can't find within the negotiations.
Because big states might block these negotiating processes or block a result that, for example, could be favorable to developing countries. I think it's important to see climate litigation being conducted in a responsible manner. I think it can be an important factor, and a factor that could stimulate that the negotiating process be better conducted, in a favorable manner for developing countries. I think it's a question, perhaps, I don't know if there's anyone else can want us to mention, but there is the famous moderation that included two countries, the South Sea of China, even though I believe that climate change question weren't faced there because the issues were of a different area of strategic, security, and even territorial questions. Dr. Nicologi, please. No, well, just to adding to our panel here, I think several points that were touched upon by both of our invitees here really touch upon environmental policies. And I'm going to talk even in the name of my colleagues of the Sin here, on it really touches upon how we've also been dealing with such issues. I think the most commented upon thing here has been blue economy. We've touched upon that many times, and this is a concept and an approach, international approach, that is being applied every time more. Perhaps I'm just stating what's obvious here, but it's different from the ocean economy or sea economy. The blue economy supposes that it's sustainable, respect to social environmental justice, and this blue economy, words that both mentioned here, is multilateralism, the importance of it. Ocean does not know borders, so this multilateral question is crucial. If it already is crucial for territorial areas or management, it's even more so for maritime ones. And another subject that was mentioned by both here is to increase capacity, especially technological innovation. If this is already important for countries such as ours, has a continental dimension, for island states is even more so when put within the context of climate crisis. And I thought that the concept of balanced approach that was cited was really interesting. The question of synergy in conflicts, to have this balance, because blue economy supposes the use of maritime resources by several sectors, considering environmental questions of sustainability. So this balance and synergy that is touched upon here is very relevant and really is aligned with how we work, but also with what was discussed in the Ocean Conference in Nice, which was highlighted by them here as well. So I think it's not just a technology, but a whole concept that is very well dealt with and seen by several countries. And that at the end of the day, all of this in terms of ocean needs to be reflected on in the planning. And that in the case that I mentioned here in Brazil, spatial maritime planning, which is an approach that wasn't created by Brazil, it's an approach by the UN, UNESCO, and is being applied in over 190 states of the world. So just finishing with what was said here, it's a very interconnected approach and very much aligned with what we are discussing daily in terms of ocean policies. Thank you. Thank you very much to Dr. João Nicolaji. Would anyone else like to speak?
The following. Our two countries have a strong presence of indigenous people and societies deeply rooted in traditional knowledge. My question is, how can we cooperate internationally to value the role of these communities and their traditional knowledge in mitigating and adapting to climate change?
Thank you for your question, Ambassador. I believe that traditional knowledge is not just our past, it is our strength for the future. And I guess I can say that the same is true here for Brazil. The indigenous people of Brazil protect the forest and rivers that help the whole world breathe. In Kiribati, our people protect the ocean and the atolls that have carried us for generations. Even though our environments are different, rainforest and ocean, our values are the same. We respect for nature. We want to respect the respect for nature, the care for community, and thinking about the future generations. And to answer your question, perhaps I would suggest three simple but powerful ways we can work together internationally. Number one, respect indigenous voice from the very beginning. Indigenous people should not only be consulted or be used as stamp, they should lead decisions about land and sea. And this entails recognizing free and informed consent, cultural ownership of knowledge, the right to say yes, no, or not now. The traditional knowledge must be used with permission and respect, not taken or copied without agreement. Another way is to bring traditional knowledge and modern science together. Our elders understand seasons, oceans, stars, winds, birds, and nature change in ways no textbook can teach. Scientists have tools like satellites, models, and sensors. When we combine both, we build stronger climate solution. For example, traditional fishing rules combined with modern fishing monitoring, star navigation combined with satellite ocean tracking, indigenous weather science combined with early warning systems. This is not just one over the other, it is using both eyes to see better. And the last one is to community learning. Perhaps we could create chances for indigenous communities from Brazil and Kiribati to learn from each other. Visit and exchanges, youth and women leadership programs, sharing methods for protecting forests, mangroves, reefs, and water, and learning food skills like the use of native crops and sustainable fishing. When communities talk to communities, we build trust and real solutions. I hope I answered your question.
Great. Thank you so much. Thank you so much. Hope we could go ahead on our cooperation.
Yeah, definitely.
Muito obrigado. Temos mais uma pergunta.
Thank you very much. We have another question. If you could please tell me who you are.
I'm the head of the Division of Australia and Pacific, Lindsay Tamarachi. So, of course, as a diplomat, I'm always looking for the nexus between Brazil and the Pacific Island. Perhaps I could look a little bit into the blue economy and energy transition. We have the islands with us, and Brazil also, for instance, in Fernando de Noronha, we are looking for renewables to change diesel for other sources of energy. And I also understand, I would like to hear your views on how the small island developing states could perhaps work together a little bit more to enhance the access to renewables, especially for small islands, to reduce their dependence on diesel fuel. Thank you.
Would you like to answer?
Let's answer.
I'll take a whack at it. Thank you, Vanessa, for your question. If I seem to understand it correctly, is what would be the solution in terms of working together with the Pacific Island nations in, trying to access renewable energy? Yeah. Okay. So I think I'm going to touch the, what people call the elephant in the room. Simply because that's where I am a little bit more engaged in than in any other parts of the ocean sector. So one of Nauru's priorities is working with the International Seabed Authority in trying to gain access to the polymetallic nodules that would eventually be used in terms of supporting complementing efforts against climate change impacts. And so we have different level of engagements, I guess, within the Pacific, but as a sponsoring state as well as in member states in ISA, obviously the obligations on us is a little bit more than those who are not. And so that's why we've kind of invested a lot of efforts in that area. And just speaking from our challenges or experience ourselves is the coordination. There is no coordination amongst like-minded countries that are pushing for the adoption of the draft regulations to eventually give a robust regulatory framework within the area that is in question. And so just trying to get the timely adoption of the draft regulations, it's already a challenge for us for Nauru. So I think that would be one of the areas, that could be an avenue to explore in terms of working together. It's not about, actually, it could be something that, you set aside the political differences and just focus on what is the mandate of the ISA. And one of those is the timely adoption of the draft regulations. Yeah, I think, it's essential. I guess it goes back to the topic in discussion about balancing the conservation and sustainable use of the ocean's resources. So we see the adoption of the draft regulations as something that could be a solution to providing this balance, this much needed balance in the work of the ISA. However, I do know that it is a highly contentious topic, so I hope I don't get attacked a bit more on that. But yeah, in response to that question is basically to, I guess, to encourage a coordination, dialogue, having these open and frank discussions to highlight what areas we can work on and what areas we can't work on. Because without dialogue, then we can't really progress. We can't really understand each other's concerns to address them. I hope that answers your question.
Alguma outra questão?
Any other question?
I'd like to thank your speakers for bringing us so many very interesting points of view and so many interesting questions. I think the very important thing that we are talking about here is that what you said about nobody wants pity. People want respect. The small countries, the small communities, the big countries, everybody needs to work really together, to not only in words but in actions, to address the problem that we were facing now. The global warming, climate change, tudo isso está interligado.
All of this is completely connected. And there's no way we can treat one thing without touching upon the other.
That reminds us of that idea that everybody wants change, but nobody wants to change. Everybody wants other people to change, other countries, other communities, other friends even. And maybe we are taking a good opportunity now at the COP30 to bring some real change, to bring some commitment between countries in order to afford agreements that can bring to a real change. What brings us to the ethical dimension that you mentioned too.
I hope this is an opportunity that we truly embrace this. This court, especially since Justice Herman's arrival, has been trying to do their part in creating environmental law jurisprudence adequate to this, and that can help in giving a clear path to the country. May we have many more moments of good discussion during COP30 in Berlin, and hopefully have concrete results. Perhaps, who knows, the 30th conference will be that one that will finally bring us something real, so that we may have a correct existence, an adequate existence in this world, and that answers to people and the planet as a whole. Justice Herman, would you like to come here and give us your final remarks? So I'd like to thank everyone, Dr. Susan, Mr. Tabatoki, Ms. Brasília, Thank you very much for your attention, President, Chief Justice Herman. Thank you. And in his name, I declare this session closed.